Hi, and welcome to the BIM podcast. We know that the spiritual life can be hard to figure out, but we also believe that everyone should know the next step for making their spiritual life more important to them. I'm Pops.
I'm Dave.
And I'm Bob.
We've called this series Why You Can Trust the Bible. And this first episode in the series is, why is the Bible not a myth?
Yeah.
Even though myths are pretty awesome.
Yeah.
It was
Super awesome. Is this the one we're doing on Thor Odinson?
Thor Odinson, that's right. We have a giant hammer for you to hold in the back.
Yeah. If I have another kid, I told my wife we're naming him Ragnar.
Oh my gosh, I can't believe.
I'm also
Does she
assuming he's
agree?
male.
Is the question? That's why
Do
you
you think
slept
she
on the
would agree
couch
to that?
last night.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think this really launches us off
I
perfectly.
go by David Popson.
Awesome.
Bob, why do you think that so many people think that the Bible is either myth, legend, or has a lot of myths and legends in it?
Yeah. I think probably there's two reasons. One is maybe what we can call the problem of miracles. So just the fact that there's a lot of people who kind of mistakenly believe that science has just proven miracles are impossible. So anything that claims miracles
Which sounds ironic.
in it, like that they actually happened, right? Yeah, is just they just say, hey, this is made up right out of the gates. And of course, the most important event in the entire New Testament, even if the rest of it was bunk, is Jesus' resurrection, which is a miracle, right? Perhaps the most important miracle. So if they were like that, they would think, hey, the New Testament, it needs to be demythologized,
Sure.
right? Second would be the problem of recording history. So I think even without the miracles, a lot of people think that the New Testament just isn't tight history. Either the original authors didn't write it till way after the events and they got a lot wrong, or people came along later on and they just totally messed up the original accounts by adding in weird stuff.
Just remixed it.
Yeah, exactly. So I think those are probably the two biggest reasons someone would say that.
Yeah.
That's great. So, Dave, why don't you explain to us briefly, why do people feel that the New Testament needs to be demythologized?
Well, because a common misconception of it would be that you've got this narrative of this Jesus person, but it's just been wrapped in overlay like a jawbreaker.
No.
Like bubble wrap. We're gonna go with that analogy. Over time of miracles and mythos and legend and and none of it's actually true. It's just kind of this like colloquial mythology of a person named Jesus, and we need to demythologize it because he was a good moral teacher, but that's just kind of it. We need to strip away any of the supernatural elements and get to the real meat of it.
Yeah.
Is what they would say.
Yeah. And I appreciate that. The first thing, though, I want to just address personally as a scientist is this idea that you raised right out of the gate. And that is that science has disproven the possibility for miracles.
Yeah, kind of. Why don't you hit that, Dad? Like, people with that perspective are dealing with the problem of miracles.
Yeah.
So how do you resolve that?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's a really common mistake, and it's totally unfounded. The problem is that most people don't understand that there are two different methods in a scientific investigation. And the one that most people are familiar with is the empirical. But people have become more and more familiar with the second type of scientific methodology called forensic investigation. And so the one type of scientific method is empirical. And what is that? That's actually investigating natural laws. That's looking at those things in and around us that are repeatable.
Repeatable.
That are repeatable, observable, and you can investigate them in the presence. Okay, and so, for example, that would be the laws of thermodynamics, the law of gravity. Okay,
Like you can do it over and over again.
That's
so whether
exactly
it's
right.
Throwing a baseball, it's going to drop, or like everything I did in high school chemistry class.
That's exactly
Try
right.
it again and again, and if you did it right, the liquid's going to turn blue.
Right, and that's, just to remind everybody, that's empirical science.
Okay, Heisenberg.
So with empirical science, just a quick reminder, observable, repeatable, and it occurs in the present.
And that's the scientific method, right?
Well, that's the thing. That's the problem. If everybody's going to tell you that's the scientific method. The problem is there's actually a second scientific
And that was
approach.
That was the forensic
and
you were
that's
saying?
Yeah, and that's the forensic. And if you watch any kind of CSI, crime scene investigation, they're not examining something that is repeatable. I mean, that dead body in front of you isn't going to get
Can you
up
die again?
Right.
and then
Right.
die again, right? They have to investigate, and they use different methods than what the empirical science will use. And so when we're talking about forensic investigation, we're talking about, number one, historical. It happened in the past. Two, it's not repeatable. Sure, there are people that are murdered, but that particular murder is unique.
Right.
So you
Right.
want to look at the unique, one-time historical incident
Nice.
that happened in the past.
I like it.
Now, when you say, I want to look at a forensic investigation of miracles, people say, oh, you can't check that. That's absolutely wrong. You can. Forensic investigation isn't just for murders. We use it in archeology. We also use it when it comes to looking at what's the origin of the universe? What's the origin of first life? What's the origin of human beings? It's also called origin science.
There you go.
But we need to recognize that when we're investigating things such as even the resurrection of Jesus Christ, there is overwhelming evidence that Jesus did in fact resurrect.
Man, that was worth the price of the ticket.
That's
Man,
exactly
just
right.
introducing that idea, the difference between empirical and forensic science. There's two scientific approaches like that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the other thing that we want to talk about in this episode is this whole problem that you brought up of, can you really trust
Right.
that the New Testament are reliable historical documents?
So kind of because you just said the problem of miracles isn't a problem. Science hasn't disproven miracles. You just need to know how to evaluate them using forensic science. So it's actually not the big of a problem that we think. So
That's
the problem
correct.
of miracles. Now you're saying, hey, let's hit the problem of recording history.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So how do we go about doing that, Bob?
Yeah. Yeah. Are there any reasons to actually believe the New Testament is accurately recorded history?
That's exactly right.
So if you're looking back over decades of archaeologists and historians and theologians and things like that who are studying these manuscripts, who are studying these writings, who are studying these events, no competent historian or philosopher or theologian denies that Jesus lived in the 1st century AD. So there was a historic person named Jesus who lived when he did. But what critics are going to claim is that you can't trust the New Testament documents as a reliable historic document, right? That's the problem, the pinch. So the thing is, there is just overwhelming evidence that these 27 books in the New Testament really are historically reliable. And that they were either written by or they were supervised by eyewitnesses of the events that happened. So let's maybe walk through that because this is worth taking our time.
Yeah, and I do want to say that we've got 3 subsequent episodes that are going to cover this in significant detail. But Dave, why don't you go ahead and just give us a thumbnail review and introduction to those so that we can get back to discussing how we know the New Testament isn't a myth.
Yeah, I'd say if there's the highlights, maybe you collaborate with me. If we're looking to start, like, okay, so the scope of the time, how long after are we talking about the events that are recorded in the New Testament, particularly the Gospels, were they happening? Was it 400 years after? No, it was
This is like 20 to 40 years.
20, 30,
People are
40
writing
years
this.
after.
Yeah.
Is that multiple generations?
No.
Is that like a single lifespan?
Right.
A decade? I mean, I'm in my 30s now. I can technically say that. And I still remember stuff when I was 4 years old like that.
Mm-hmm.
So also, when my wife thinks I'm a bit of a freak. But man, Christmas 1995. That was a
was a
banger.
good one.
It was a good one. But yeah, so but that's also to point out that the persons, places, and events in the Gospels aren't just, again, like you said, farcical, easy to be not corrupted in their integrity, but these things have been corroborated time and time and time again.
Yeah.
Yeah, you look at Luke
Through
and Acts.
archaeology.
Yeah.
All the places that are mentioned, yeah.
Yep. So
I mean, you've been to Turkey, bro. Like, you've seen these places.
yeah, it was pretty overwhelming, I'll just say, because it's really easy to treat this like a scholastic endeavor, especially being an American, right? I'm in my 30s. I'm a millennial. And anyone with a reasonable head on their shoulders would think, like, I have no way to, like, even relate to this thing. This just seems like it happened in a different world, on a different timeline. For all I know, this could be, like, Tolkien fiction. But to have stood there and be like, no, this is literally Mary's home. Here's Paul's well. Here's where his tent stand was. Like, and we know that because of blah 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 blah. All this unreal. There's an archaeologist named Nelson Glueck. You Google him. The note I have was he had written that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. And when you look at everything in there, from Luke's account of Caesar Augustus, Tiberius, Pontius Pilate, everything in between, and then all the archaeological finds across all the countries, I mean, it is astoundingly supported. But there's more to come.
Yeah, so let's just get to the skinny. How do we deal with somebody who says legends and myths have crept into the New Testament?
That's impossible for two reasons. There's two things you need for a myth or for a legend to develop: time and seclusion.
Mm-hmm.
It takes time. It takes 2 generations after an event happens for people who were not actually there.
Yep.
Right? So that 60 or 80 years after, and we don't have that.
Right. Because you just said it's 20 to 40 years since the events actually occurred that they were written.
That things like the Synoptic Gospels, right?
Yeah,
Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or 1 Corinthians, Paul's letter, was written, and it refers directly to Christ's resurrection happening. These were written just a couple of decades after. It takes time. We don't have that.
Right.
Second is it takes seclusion. Not having enough witnesses around to the event so that no one could call you out.
Right.
That if you change a real event into a kind of a tall tale. We definitely don't have seclusion,
Yeah.
right? Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, so open your Bible at some point, read 1 Corinthians 15, verse 6, he writes, there were over 500 witnesses to Jesus' resurrection, and at that writing, most of them were already there. Yeah. They were alive when this letter was getting written around. So there's a guy, a famous Roman historian from a number of decades back, but his name was A.N. Sherwin White, and he calls the mythological view of the New Testament unbelievable.
Yeah.
In the bad way.
In the bad way. Like, it is not
no
believable
merit.
to say that the New Testament is a myth, and I agree with him.
Yeah.
Okay, but there's another claim that we need to really just wipe out right away. And that is, well, you know what? These writers of the New Testament, when they wrote the books of the New Testament, they just borrowed those myths from other cultures, other beliefs.
Yeah.
Well, there's no categorical or conceptual merit to that. No semblance of similarity exists between even Greek and Roman mythologies. There's certainly no example of a monotheistic God being incarnate, born of a virgin, dies, is resurrected, lives the life that Jesus did. Again, all of this being like literal and physical, not just philosophical and talking about gods and their behaviors in Athens or the heavens. We're talking about a real human, again, that has this historicity and authenticity to it. Let alone the fact that there's no, not just no narrative that the Gospels would have been modeled or mimicked after, but there are examples after the Bible that do mirror or mimic the Gospels, which I find interesting.
Yeah, so other cultures stealing the Christian
but not the inverse.
Story.
Yeah. Well, and even the Gospels themselves, even from a textual criticism standpoint, don't show any signs of being mythological writings.
Yeah, and
you have people like Luke who are, very intelligent people by profession and who are writing these things with great historical accuracy. Just even the outline of it, right? They don't lend to mythology. If you don't know what I'm saying, go to the mythology section at Barnes & Noble and you'll be like, oh, yeah, the Gospels are not that thing.
No, they're not. And in fact, one of my favorite writers, one of your guys' favorite writers, C.S. Lewis, right? Mm-hmm. He knows a little bit about fiction. He knows a little bit about myth and legend from the Narnia series, right?
Well, and that was his job.
That's exactly right. He's an Oxford and Cambridge professor. We're not talking about somebody off the street. This is what he wrote in Christian Reflections. All I am in private life is a literary critic and historian. That's my job. And I'm prepared to say on that basis, if anyone thinks the Gospels are either legends or novels, then that person is simply showing his incompetence as a literary critic. I've read a great many novels. And I know a fair amount about the legends that grew up among early people. And I know perfectly well the Gospels are not that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. All right, so we come to the end of the podcast. So what? Dave, how should all of this affect our lives?
Yeah, well, the conclusion's pretty clear in my opinion. The New Testament, especially the Gospels, they don't show any sign of being myth or legend. The miracles in them are just surrounded by historical facts, historical references, real people, real places, real time that have been confirmed repeatedly by archaeology and contemporary non-Christian writings, I will add. Mm-hmm. So anyone who chooses to deny the historical merit and reliability of the New Testament, frankly, they're just basing their own opinions on outdated and inaccurate information, and probably have just an anti-supernatural bias.
Yeah, that's good.
Regardless.
Which I'll say, like, if it was me, I would naturally have one of these big objections. This would be one of the biggies for me. Like, if I wasn't a Christian, I doubted my faith. But
Yeah.
there's just too much evidence there to say no. Like,
Yeah.
this isn't a myth.
Yeah.
Which is why we're doing this,
Mhm.
because we want those people who are believers,
Yep.
young, new believers, to have this.
When they
to
get
be
that
able to-
pushback. Yeah.
That's exactly right. So, Dave, Bob, give us a call to action.
I'm the less good-looking one of your sons. Yeah,
False.
I know.
True. Dan is the most handsome. I would agree.
That is true. That is true.
I don't mind being third place.
What's your next step? Trust the New Testament. Keep reading in the New Testament. I hope you're reading it. I hope you're spending a little bit of time, maybe even every day, reading the Bible. But in the New Testament, keep trusting that what it records is actually true. If you wrestle with doubt, like about Jesus' miracles that it talks about, or even maybe who the letters, like Paul's letters, claim that God is really like, well, use this episode and listening to it or watching it as an opportunity to bring your little faith to God. And remember, God raised Jesus from the dead. He did, right?
Amen.
And he can certainly do, and he can certainly be everything else, therefore, that it says about him in his word and that the New Testament claims about him. So if God's helping you believe a certain truth, a certain miracle, a certain passage, tell us what it is. Let us know in the comments here. Let us know on socials, because we love walking alongside with you in this journey as we're all figuring out our next step in our spiritual lives.
Yeah,
man.
thank you.
Amen.
And thank you for joining us for this episode of the Ben Min Podcast. We know that the Christian life can be hard to figure out, but we also believe that everyone should know the next step for making their spiritual life more important to them.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for joining us today. Recognize that this took time and intentionality for you to listen to this while you're driving, or maybe you're actually watching our ugly mugs on YouTube. Thank you either way. So best way to support this ministry, if you believe in it, would be subscribing, engaging, especially on socials, Instagram and TikTok. We have a lot of new content coming out there constantly. But on the website, benmin.org, you can actually support the ministry. If you're called to do so. You can also sign up for the newsletter, which frankly is the best way to keep up to date with what's going on here, especially as the ministry grows. So you can support and learn more about the men and women behind the scenes who are doing great things for the kingdom. So thankful for you joining us here. We'll look forward to the next episode, and hope you have a wonderful day. God bless.